this period that the rights are more important than anything else. Everything else comes second. I think we can agree that both of them are correct, that there is a lot to be done for African Americans and a conspicuous sort of absence of enforcement by the government. The funny thing for me in some ways is that Du Bois kind of looks at Washington as this sort of great what could have been. And I think in many ways it comes from the fact that you have two very, again, look at the two very different men and how they're posed and how they're dressed and everything. So I think it's kind of interesting that he writes this book in the early 19th, The Souls of Black Folks, about what is on the mind of African Americans of wealth and means. And no surprise, they sort of make it very clear that they feel that Washington has let them down. Again, that the Atlanta Compromise speech has been a betrayal of their principles, that, you know, in trying to make everybody happy, he's in fact destroyed the opportunities for many people. But I'd also point out that Washington is the highest, most profile black person in 1895 to 1910 when he passes away. So let's be realistic. That's a lot of pressure on somebody to be the spokesperson for your entire race. It's not exactly an ideal circumstance anyone would want. And so when he writes this book, he's writing it from sort of the outsider's perspective as, you know, we feel you've done this and done this. So don't get us wrong, we think you did a good job, but we think you've let this sort of wealthy, more influential, more educated proportion of African Americans down. The irony in some respects is that the same criticism can hit Du Bois after Washington dies. Because when Washington passes away in 1910, Du Bois is in the middle of creating the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. The reality being that he's pushing for a much more aggressive enforcement of civil rights, a more aggressive approach in the issue of segregation. So when Washington dies, all of a sudden it becomes, well, Mr. Du Bois, what do black people want? You're in the same position you, ironically enough, were criticizing somebody else for me. Throughout the 1910s, Du Bois' position was a much more aggressive approach, coming out in opposition to lynching, publicly denouncing attacks on people, demanding the government investigate and prosecute people. Did it work? Not necessarily, but it does draw attention. In addition, where Du Bois sort of criticized Washington for sort of dealing and kowtowing to white people, I would point out that 1/3 of the membership of the NAACP when it was founded was white. And Du Bois was the member of several major political parties, where he was essentially in many cases the token black man, the Progressive Party and a few of these other organizations. So you have a situation which even for Du Bois and others, there is a concern. Now he rejects Washington's support for Republicans early on, claiming they've done nothing, so he advocates for a third-party perspective. The defining moment for Du Bois comes during World War I. He realizes in many ways that this is the chance for African Americans to achieve a new level of prominence. He looks at what women have done and how they have joined the workforce in record numbers and how this is basically pushing governments across the world, the United States, Great Britain, Germany, to finally give women the right to vote. So Du Bois joins a growing chorus of African American leaders who say during World War I, black people, sign up, go fight, go work, go serve. You want to get treated seriously, you want people to give you your rights, go show that you're an active, vital part of this country. The irony is, the president during World War I is Woodrow Wilson. He is an avowed segregationist. And his perspective is very simple. Black people are inferior. They cannot serve in frontline combat. In fact, so the irony is that Du Bois is avidly pushing for black people, not just in the United States, but all over the world, to go and enlist. Go enlist and fight with the British Army. Go fight with the French. Go fight with the Germans. Go fight and get your voice heard. Jason. Tiny cheap. The reality being, it becomes a bit of a joke. Because no sooner do thousands of black people actually sign up and volunteer to fight, than Wilson issues a declaration saying that no black person will see frontline combat. There'll be janitors, stevedores, cooks, porters, things like that, but they're not intended to see frontline combat. Now the irony is every other country amongst the Allies have frontline African American troops, except for the United States. So some people are going to walk to blog going, hey man, you told us if we fought we'd get our rights. Well, it's a little complicated. So after the war is over, he sort of confronts President Wilson and the world leaders, especially President Wilson, during a meeting in Paris, but what he sees is the failure of the U.S. to recognize black civil rights. The problem is, by that point, everybody around the world is sort of taking the perspective of, okay, not only is Dubois calling for full civil rights for African Americans, he's calling for a total end of European colonization and control of Africa. The end of all empires, essentially. So when he goes to Paris in 1919 and sort of say, President Wilson, we demand full political civil rights, we demand the freedom of Africa, nobody takes him seriously. The Pan-African Congress, as it's called, becomes a huge, massive farce in some ways, because they come expect to be treated as equals, and the perspective of the world leaders is, who are you and why are you here? So as you go into the 1920s, there's lots of black leaders like Marcus Garvey and others who are saying, you know, you forgot about the economics, Mr. Dubois. Where's the economics? People only pay attention to people who've got money, which is very much kind of an echo of what Washington said, is that money is very important if you want to be taken seriously, not just for your own safety and protection and for your family, but if you want people to take you seriously, you need to have money to back it up. So Dubois starts getting hit by people who are saying, well, you screwed this up, and all of a sudden in the 1920s you have the resurgence of the Klan that seems to fly smack in the face of everything that's happened. Dubois has also become frustrated. He feels the Democrats and the Republicans have left him down. So throughout the 1920s he begins a political journey that will eventually turn him into a public enemy. First he becomes a socialist, because socialism and both communism, along with anarchism and other movements, believe there's no race, no creed, no color, no religion. Everybody's equal. And everybody should be treated equally and given the same political rights. So you can see why somebody like Dubois, who is an intellectual, will be very attracted to socialism, all right? The idea of full equality, all right? But by the late 1920s, he's not a socialist anymore, he's a communist. He's a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. So by the 1930s, you have a difficult situation. With the rise of the Soviet Union and the rise of Stalin, more and more pressure is being placed on Americans to sort of put your signature on the dotted line. Which side are you on? So when it becomes more and more public about his political views, he's eventually pushed out of the NAACP and pushed out of most organizations that he founds. Then he goes into a 20-year exile period. Again, by the 1960s and his 90s, he's come back as a major player and recognized as one of the most significant and important men of the last 100 years. But the irony in some ways is that a lot of the criticism he put upon Washington was the criticism that was put upon him after he died. All right. Now, ironically enough, we do have a number of prominent African-American women. Most famously in this state, it's Maggie Walker. But probably the most famous black woman of the late 1800s was that woman, Ida Barnett Wells. Born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee, she was born into slavery. Ida ends up going to a college and becomes a journalist. And by the early 1890s, Ida is one of the most respected black journalists in the United States. She's also one of the most high-profile female journalists in the United States. Ida came from Memphis, Tennessee, and as she writes about in her book, she talks about how Memphis was not exactly the most racially tolerant places, but unlike a lot of places in the American South, there wasn't a great deal of violence. And then she says, when he got to the 1890s, all of a sudden people went crazy. In fact, in her hometown, a few weeks after she graduated from college, there was an incident. I mentioned this last time in class about the 3 black men that opened the grocery store in Memphis, and they all got lynched by the white competition who claimed this was a negative impact on them during the Depression. So I think the thing that's kind of interesting to me in some respects is that you have this woman who basically, because of this experience and having seen it sort of happen firsthand, becomes actively involved in it. Eventually she marries a prominent black lawyer and they move to Chicago. She becomes one of the major reporters on the Chicago Defender, which at the time was the largest black newspaper in the country. In fact, her specialty is lynching. For almost 10 years, she is the national authority on the issue of lynching in the United States. And by the way, she only stands about 5 foot tall and 100 pounds. Ida, every year, makes sure the Chicago Defender runs on their front page a list of every person lynched in the United States by state and by name, along with the alleged offense. She even eventually writes a series of reports for various organizations and a book about this whole phenomenon to draw attention to it and push the government to do something. In addition, Ida didn't pull any punches. She was one of those people who was very convinced that the way African Americans were being treated in society and portrayed in society was unacceptable. I first encountered Ida when I was doing my research in my master's thesis on the World's Fair in 1893 in Chicago. she'd written a book called What's Wrong with the Columbian Exposition. All right? Basically, Ida wrote a 200-page book trashing the fair, and there's lots of reasons for that. One, Ida was concerned at how African Americans were presented. When they first created the idea of the fair in the late 1880s, it was supposed to be a sort of scientific discussion of what it's like to live around the world, all right? And the original intention had been to have what they called basically a hall of nations, all right? Essentially, it was going to be a giant open area in the middle of this huge, vast fairground where they would invite nations from around the world to put up exhibits, all right? And in many cases, they were talking about putting up, historical exhibits and exhibits about Africa and African culture. Again, legitimate museum quality expositions, all right? The problem was the board of directors eventually decided that would not actually attract visitors, it would actually cost them money. So again, you got to see the sort of tourism side. So they eventually went to the chairman of anthropology at Harvard and asked him what his suggestion was. Well, the chairman of anthropology was one of the biggest protagonists of the idea of racial inferiority and social Darwinism. So when he came in, he had a couple of ideas. So it was supposed to be originally a very scholarly and sort of educational experience, almost like kind of walking through Epcot Center or Disney World, turned into something very else. He very quickly decided that this whole area shouldn't just be about presentation. It should be about excitement and entertainment. So when a guy named George Ferris presented his designs for something called a Ferris wheel, they decided, hey, why not put this in the middle of the whole Hall of Nations thing? You've heard the word midway, like games and arcades at a carnival or a fair. Where do you think it came from? This area was called the midway because it's literally the midway point of the entire thing. So the idea of a midway being carnival and games, sort of weird freak show kind of activities, came from this exhibit. Because all of a sudden, with the introduction of these different things, the chairman of anthropology, who was now the head of this sort of called programming for this exhibit, decided, well, we can't just simply allow an exhibit to be here. We have to make it productive and fun and interesting and raise money, and it has to match everything else. So he began to push for exhibits that were designed to be exotic, strange, and downright freakish, all right? So that people would buy more tickets, all right? So they'd already had a few commitments. So for instance, they were going to rebuild a Turkish bazaar and an Egyptian-style bazaar in the middle of this, all right? They were going to do Eskimo villages, all right? They'd had commitments from Cossacks from Russia to do exhibits. They'd had commitments from the Japanese. They'd had commitments from the Tahitians to build recreations of their villages. So it was kind of cool and kind of impressive. But then there became this whole thing of, well, we have to have one from each country. So next thing you know, you get Bedouins from North Africa. No, we have to have more from Africa. We have to have more exhibits. So eventually it was decided, you know what, we need to do something. There have been other exhibits like this in other fairs across the world. And the thing they discovered that had sort of sold the most tickets and made the most comments was when they had people bring in and recreate villages. All right? And so the genius of the fair decided that to represent Africa, they weren't going to pick any sort of village, not the Zulus, not the Swahilis, not anybody. They were going to pick pygmies. I'm assuming you guys know what a pygmy is. Apparently not. That is a pygmy. Pygmies are a Central to Southern African tribe that are most known for being unusually short. All right? So think about it. You could have picked anything. And what do you pick? All right? In addition, they also had a request to make something more exotic and dangerous. They actually brought in a bunch of headhunters from Papua New Guinea. Cannibals. All right. So instead of having a real working traditional African village, again, it is a real working village. But instead of having, can you see the freak show aspect? All right. So this is the exhibit that goes in. You get an Irish village, you get a German village, a Russian village, a South American village, a Caribbean village, and this is what represents Africa. All right. Now, if that was not insulting enough, they also started having contests between the various groups. All right. And 1 week they had an Olympic-style ceremony, whereby all the different groups competed against each other in tests of physical strength and mental endurance. No surprise, the reporters pointed out that, man, those little pygmies can sure run. Right? So again, lots of these sort of depictions, and that became one of the big concerns a lot of people like Wells had was, where is the scientific merit? All right? If we're doing an accurate representation of Africa, why did you pick these people? Why not pick somebody else? You did it because you're trying to make a point about them being freakish and weird and discredit Africa in general. In addition, she also complained that there were no major African exhibits about African Americans in the United States. All right? Where's the emphasis on black Americans? There was 1 day scheduled. By the way, it's the next to last day for the fair. All right? And then she points out, why are the only black people you see at the fair janitors, stevedores, cooks, or shoe shine boys? Why are there no prominent black people at the fair? And by the way, she was thrown out of the fair and never allowed back because she went to a press conference promoting the fair at the start of it, and I started asking these questions. You got to see why I like her. She's a pretty smart woman. But again, you can see the criticism. Again, and that was another thing she had with Washington, Dubois, and these other people was they're praising the fair as some sort of, you know, oh, we're bringing the world together. And she's like, are you crazy? Look at what they're putting out there. Look at how they're treating black people. Look at the programs they created to highlight these exhibits, portrayed the pygmies as having giant bones out their snout, sort of eating people. All right? Really disgusting, horrific imagery. And she said not just that. When they did programs on black people and images of black people from the United States, it's the old Stephen Fetchit stuff, the Jim Crow crap. All right? Yes, all maps look sort of coming along like that. And she got mad. And she said, this is stupid, this is ridiculous. And people said, well, you know, if it's bringing money in and it's bringing people in, and at least they had a Negro Day. They didn't have to do that. It was the first one to have a Negro Day. She's like, well, yeah, they have to do something because what did they just do to our reputations and our presentation around the world? It made us look like total idiots. So by 1900, she's a woman who provoked a lot of conflict. And by 1900, let's just say there was one final incident. After years of publishing her articles in Chicago, there were several death threats and an attempt on her life. And so she and her husband, by 1905, decided the simplest solution, and probably the safest solution, was to pack up their growing family and to move. So they moved to New York. Now, she continued to write, but by 1910, her interest had gone away from lynching towards the fact that black women were not allowed to vote. In fact, she's a major player on the East Coast in the women's suffrage movement. How many people have seen Iron Jawed Angels, that Hillary Swank movie? All right. You know the black woman that walks in their office early on in the movie and says she wants to march, and they said, well, you can't march with us, you have to march to the back of the parade. Is President Wilson. That's Ida Wells. Look in the credits. Ida B. Wells. It's in the credits. I was sitting there, I'm like, it's Ida. I was really certain it was Ida Wells. And then they tossed the reference in at the end of the movie, and I'm like, oh, come on. Come on. Can't you just give us her name? You know, because those of us who knew it was Ida Wells. She lived to be 80, all the way into the 1940s, actively pursuing the rights of black women and drawing attention to the way they were treated. So I think it's kind of interesting that you have three very different perspectives on this issue in some ways. You have Washington, Dubois, and you have Wells, all of whom agree that the United States is not doing anything toward the level of what they should. The difficulty becomes having someone take you seriously and the work you're doing, again, no surprise. If you look at Ida Wells gets death threats and somebody tries to kill her, and she's living in Chicago. So that could happen to her. You've got to imagine what could potentially happen to other people. So we have a situation where throughout the end of the 1800s, there's a marked increase in racist and bigoted behavior. Not just against African Americans, but also against other minority groups as well. On the West Coast, it was the Chinese and any Asian American who sort of got the rancor of West Coast people. The 1830s and 1840s sees the first major importation of Asian Americans, particularly Korean and Chinese, to the United States, many of whom began to work on the West Coast railroads. The name coolies was originally created by the Brits as a name for water bearers in India. It became a general and very racist term for Chinese people out west. Now, as soon as they came, they did exactly what a lot of the gangs and groups did on the East Coast. On the East Coast, you had the Irish and the Italian, the Russian, and the Jewish gangs who sort of got together to provide protection for their people. On the West Coast, it's the Tongs and the Triads. All right? Out on the West Coast, you have a bunch of these sort of groups that emerge, particularly in a lot of these Chinese communities. Now, at the same time, their numbers become very extensive, and lots of them by 1850, 1860, because of the fact that Asia's economy is not that strong. Japan is not yet industrialized. China, Korea, and a lot of the Asian nations are on the verge of industrialization. Many of these countries are poor, they're politically disastrous, and a lot of people are basically being ruled by oppressive dictators. So no surprise, there's going to be a mass push to the United States for them to come over. In addition, that does create a set of problems. In many places, it's going to lead to widespread violence. There were incidents along the construction of the West Coast railroads whereby Chinese workers were just simply taken out, shot, and dumped in lakes. I'll give you an example. I talked to a student of mine a few years ago, we were talking about this, and she told me a story. Her son lives in Lake Tahoe on the California-Nevada border. And there's a story about